Politics Live.
Coming up on today's programme.
If you believe in freedom, you have to accept that people have to be free to make bad decisions as well as good decisions.
An independent review has found that if we stand by and do nothing, nearly 500,000 more people will die from smoking by the end of this decade.
Tory divisions in the Commons, but MPs back a ban on cigarettes for anyone born from 2009 onwards. Inflation falls from 3.4 to 3.2%.
Our plan is working, and my simple message would be, if we stick to that plan, people can have confidence that there's a brighter future ahead.
But the number of people on long-term sick is up.
It was the worst thing in the world for me to be able to stop working. I hated it. I still hate it.
Energy production or food production? What's our countryside for?
It's a terrible waste of what we regard as top-quality productive arable land. And there is only a finite amount of that in the country.
Labour are miles ahead in the polls, but can Keir Starmer seal the deal with the electorate? And, of course, the Labour leader takes on Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live. Joining us today, Conservative Deputy Chairman Angela Richardson, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, journalist and Keir Starmer biographer Tom Baldwin, and former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng. This is Politics Live. Hello, and let's start with that pretty historic vote in the Commons yesterday. The headline here in the Mirror: vote for smoking ban, the cig-free generation. This is the headline, though, on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which say leadership hopefuls defy Sunak over smoking ban. Yes, because he didn't have the support, the Prime Minister, of all his ministers or members of the Cabinet. To open the programme, though, is it a historic moment? It's the first step towards banning cigarettes for a generation of children, or a win for the health police?
I think it's an historic moment. I supported the legislation yesterday. There's no safe level of smoking. And I think if we want to see the NHS free at the point of use for everyone going forward, we need to look at the costs of these things. £17 billion a year cost to the NHS and wider, where we're only getting £10 billion in terms of tax revenue on cigarettes. So for me, it's a no-brainer. What I want to be careful about, though, is vaping. I think we need to look into that a bit more closely because of the young people who particularly have never smoked but are taking up vaping.
Barry, what's your view? Was it a historic moment, a first step towards banning cigarettes for that generation, or is it, as you heard there in the headlines from the Tory MP Jake Berry and former Prime Minister Liz Truss, a march of the health police?
Well, look, I understand the arguments about freedom, and freedom is important, and Jake Berry was right to say that you know, freedom is about being able to make the wrong choice, but addiction means you're not free. And cigarette smoking is about addiction, and that takes away people's freedom of choice. And what I think has been so pernicious is the way in which tobacco companies have actually targeted young people, and the sales, the underage sales in this country, are exponentially increased. And that means they're targeting them when they're young in order to get them addicted, and then their freedom is gone. So I think this is a really important measure. I agree with Angela. This is really important in protecting a generation, and I hope will mean that that generation does not suffer the same addictions and then the same health problems that their parents have.
I mean, you weren't able to vote for important reasons last night, but you would have voted for the ban.
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, I was slipped from the whip because I had a community meeting with those who'd been suffering in the fire in my constituency. Yeah.
Tom?
I started smoking at 15 and I wish I'd never started. We've always had restrictions on freedom. I don't think the Tory leadership hopefuls who voted against the ban yesterday are now going to propose legalising heroin or legalising cannabis, which is a restriction of freedom that we do. What's interesting, I think, is this is actually a fairly sensible policy, fairly popular, but the Tory leadership contenders aren't looking to the electorate anymore. They're looking at the selectorate. They're looking at a party membership which is enthralled to different forms of ideology, in this case a rather libertarian ideology, and the membership doesn't really look like the country. And that's why you had Liz Truss.
You were raising your eyes to the ceiling there, Anita, as Tom was talking about the selectorate that the Tory hopefuls, leadership hopefuls, are bidding towards.
Well, I was kind of questioning the entire framing because actually this is a really complicated issue and lots of people have their hearts tugged in both directions, including myself, who obviously I'm not a smoker, I have never taken up smoking and I can see all the benefits. But I am a little bit uncomfortable at the measure that we've chosen because this is not about restricting children from being able to access cigarettes. This is about adults. And we do have to draw lines and they are necessarily arbitrary. And I think that we all agree on the end goal that we want to achieve here, which is to have fewer people smoking and a smoke-free generation. It's just whether this strikes the right balance. So I just think that this way of talking about it as though it's only really about kind of, are you banging your libertarian credentials? I don't think that quite kind of really encapsulates the complexities of this, especially around issues like enforcement, for instance. So I think that we absolutely are, and it is a historic moment. The UK is going in a direction that no other country has gone in yet, and I think that there is a noble intention here. It's just whether we've gotten that balance quite right and whether we can actually enforce and deliver something that genuinely does stop children from smoking, for instance, which is already illegal.
Do you think it is going to be easy to enforce this, Tom?
Well, yeah, if people want to break the law, they probably will. And, you know, there's people who take illegal drugs at the moment. I used to smoke before it was legal to smoke. I used to go to pubs before it was legal to go to pubs. I mean, people do break the law, but I think if you can make it more difficult for our children to get addicted to smoking, that's probably a good thing.
And isn't the point that it's not just about stopping people? If people know that it is against the law,
you think it'll slip into the consciousness?
Most people then won't do it. I mean, a lock will always protect you against an honest man. A thief will be able to break a lock. But the point is, if the law is there, then people who want to abide by the law won't then take up the activity.
It was quite striking, Angela, to pick up on Tom's first point. I mean, Rishi Sunak will stand up at Prime Minister's questions today, knowing that almost half of the people behind him, Tory MPs, chose not to back the ban. What does that say about unity in the Tory party?
Well, I think we need to look back to 2006 and when Labour brought in smoking ban indoors. It was a free vote for Labour MPs and many of the Cabinet voted against it. I think it says more about the Labour Party that they had to whip their MPs to get them to come through and support it and not give them a free vote on the issue.
Well, 2006 wasn't, as far as I remember, particularly united time for the Labour Party. What's interesting is Labour were able to whip their MPs and the Tory party weren't able to whip their MPs because they knew they'd have a rebellion.
But this is more important than party politics. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of people who are dying because they have smoked. My father, when I was 8 years of age, died from esophageal cancer because he smoked. The impact that it has on families across this country is huge. And really, Angela, we can't turn it into a party political issue. I think it was great yesterday that we had that solidity between both parties saying,
but
look,
I sat in the chamber
important.
and I listened to Wes Streeting make it political and call out those different things. So whilst there is unity on the substance of the issue across the bench, I think Labour didn't hesitate in trying to make it political yesterday.
Well, let's talk about the economy and inflation. This is the BBC News headline. UK inflation falls as meat and crumpet prices drop. This, of course, is the rate at which prices are rising. They're slowing, but there are indications that some products, food products, are beginning to come down. Services and petrol prices still rather sticky, so the rate of inflation not coming down as quickly, perhaps, as people expected. But the plan's working. It's done.
Well, of course, the independence of the Bank of England means that the Bank of England have responsibility for keeping inflation to the target. And look, we should all be thankful that inflation is coming down. If you look at the impact that the cost of living crisis has had on families in this country, it's enormous. If you look at the way in which just this month so many hundreds of thousands of people across this country whose mortgages are coming up for renewal are going to see themselves paying hundreds of pounds more a month for their mortgages. There is a huge problem in the cost of living in this country. So great, let's see inflation come down. I'd like it to come right down to the 2% target that it should be.
That's the prediction, isn't it, in the next few months? But there is an issue still with those high interest rates, or certainly high by recent historic standards, Angela, and perhaps the Bank of England delaying further a decision to cut that because inflation is coming down, but not as fast as perhaps people had wanted this time.
So I think the important thing is that inflation is coming down. And I think last time we were expecting figures, the inflation dropped lower than what we were expecting. So, you know, forecasts are all good and well as to what's going to happen, and the data comes out and sometimes it's slightly variable, but the most important point is we're heading in the right direction. We're seeing, it might be small growth, but we're seeing growth. The recession that we had in the last quarter of last year was very shallow and short-lived, and I think there was a lot of pushback in January. You know, it's all doom and gloom, but many people said in January the economy is already growing. We're already out of recession, and it did grow by 0.3% in January. Yes, it was 0.1% in February, but it is predicted to grow by 0.8% this year.
Oh, well. Well, let me ask Tom. I mean, Labour, if they win the election, could be inheriting a slightly growing economy at this rate.
Very slightly growing economy from a very, very low base. And that's what Labour are going to be talking about between now and the general election, I believe. I'd be very surprised if they don't talk about it today at PMQs, because it's been 14 years that, you know, when you talk about going in a better direction, the direction's been downwards. It's been a disaster, and nothing more so than that period when Liz Truss was in charge. And when people talk about, oh, our plan's working, they're turning around and saying, you lot have put us in this. It's you lot who gave us higher interest rates. It's you lot who wrecked this economy. Don't tell me now you're in a slightly better direction. You've screwed this up. And that's what they're going to be saying. And I think they've got a point.
So I would say since 2010 our record has been that we were able to get debt down and get into a position where the pandemic came.
The highest debt that this country has ever had.
We've been the fastest growing economy since 2010. Yes, but if you think
we haven't got debt down. No, you said we got debt down.
No, we did from 2010 to 2019, and then we had.
Then what happened?
Then the pandemic came.
And Brexit. And Liz Truss.
I think it's really important to think back to the end of World War II and the debt. No, the debt that we had. We talk about the highest debt that we've had since that time. There was a reason we had that debt. There is a reason we spent £407 billion to protect lives and livelihoods during the pandemic. It's our job now to pay that down in a sensible way so that we do not leave that debt to our children and our grandchildren. But the other thing that a lot of people don't realise is it's impossible to get inflation down with an economy that's going gangbusters in terms of growth. I think we proved that back in September, October 2022, that if you really go for growth, inflation isn't going to come down.
So is that what happened, Angela? The government's really, really resisted going for growth. It's not that it couldn't actually get any growth.
It's not that it's resisting, but the two things can't happen at the same time. If you talk to economists, they will tell you the same. And look, Rishi Sunak, it told us during the leadership election in 2022 exactly what was going to happen with the economy. And I just wish more people had listened.
And the public are switched on, right? They do understand that there has been a war in Ukraine. They understand the impact of the pandemic. They understand that actually we are seeing interest rates go up around the world, supply chain shortages.
But our rate of inflation has been higher than most comparable EU countries, certainly up until recently.
And it's been a really challenging period. But I think that there is something of this. If we pretend there are kind of very simplistic, glib answers to these very sophisticated problems about our economy, then I think you set the public up for disappointment and feeling of disillusionment when there isn't immediately endless and boundless amounts of growth and inflation at less than 2%, and it's all the land of milk and honey. There are real, difficult and challenging choices to be made, and global events very much buffet the UK economy, much like many others.
Well, let's talk about global events, because Angela asked us to go back to the end of the Second World War, when we did have the highest debt. What did a Labour government do then? A Labour government at that point invested in creating the National Health Service, the largest home building, Homes for Heroes, the largest home building that this country had ever seen.
And is that what Labour's promising to do now if it wins the election?
What I'm saying is there are choices to be made even when you have that high level of debt. Labour made the right choices on that occasion, and here, over the past 14 years, the government has consistently made the wrong choices, which is why we've got over 7 million people on the waiting lists in our
well,
NHS.
let's just pick up on that, because this in the Times is the headline. Record number out of work because of long-term sickness. You were talking about the challenges, the really prosaic challenges that are facing the UK. This is one of the key ones. Now, why?
Yeah, it's absolutely brutal, the numbers that have been coming out since the pandemic. And actually, during the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation about people exiting the workforce. And actually, that was, in large part, or a significant part of that, was women 50s and above just deciding to kind of leave the workforce. And that sort of made sense. What we're seeing now is a net influx of 600,000 people coming into long-term sick, leaving work because they are sick. This is one of those challenges that requires the might of every single person that cares about politics and policy and society. And it's not clear yet that we really understand why this is happening. And until we do, there's no easy solution from immigration to anything else that will repair the damage that will happen in subsequent years.
Anita's right, the figures are absolutely stark. I mean, the Health Foundation are reporting a study which found a record 3.7 million workers in England will have major illness by 2040, Tom, and chronic pain, type 2 diabetes, anxiety and depression are forecast to grow at a faster rate in more deprived areas. What would a Labour government do about that?
I think we have to be quite careful about how we talk about this. And, there's a sort of theme emerging. This is about work-shy Britain or snowflakes among young people, and they're all claiming they're mentally ill. In terms of economic inactivity, it's actually much lower now than it was. It's declined since the 1980s and 1990s. In 1983, it's 26%, now 22%. Now, there are lots of reasons. It's complicated why it's going up again now. Part of it is a benefit system, which is so mean that you have to maybe claim long-term sickness to avoid destitution. Part of it is the fact we haven't got a functioning NHS which can help people get better.
Well, I mean, that is certainly true in terms of the waiting lists, Anita. But in terms of the solutions, what are the options that the government is undertaking? Mel Stride did use language that implied people might be on long-term sickness benefits because it suits them rather than for genuine reasons. What do you say?
Well, I think the challenge is that it requires a lot of investment to get one person from long-term sick back into the workplace. And the longer people stay away from the workplace, the longer it takes to get them back in and the amount of resources it takes. So it really has got to be a kind of national mission, because the benefit to society is worth it, but actually it doesn't give you that short-term hit that you might get when you improve other problems, because it does take an extraordinary amount of focus.
Has there been a cultural shift since the pandemic too?
Look, I don't know about a cultural shift, but what I do know is that if you want to get people back into the workplace, you cannot afford to have 7 million of them waiting for hospital treatment. And that's why the Labour Party has said that if we were lucky enough to be in government, we would be investing over £1 billion right at the beginning to make sure that we got over 1 million people with the scans, with the diagnoses, the diagnostic tests, with those operations being done, because we need to get people back into the workforce. Now, there's a separate issue of chronic illness, which Tom and Anita talked about. And the way to do that, it seems to me, is precisely by the preventative steps that we talked about at the beginning of the programme, where people are not being enabled to get into smoking and addictions. When you're tackling these things in a preventative way, then that stops all the sort of the lung disease, it stops all the heart disease that eventually you end up with. But it's about tackling it in a preventative way, and that's much more long-term. But the immediate, get that investment in, that's what Labour's committed to do, and that'll mean 1 million extra people coming back into work, and that's what our economy needs.
Angela?
There's record investment into the NHS. The new money in the autumn statement, new money in the budget that we've just had. I think people who are long-term sick deserve our compassion and our care, but also our encouragement. I think there genuinely is a problem. You can't deny it from the figures that have come out. And I think COVID has hit the country very hard. And, you know, there's fiscal recovery and then there's the recovery of the country.
So what's the problem that you're saying there is a real problem? What is it?
I think the problem is that that people's mental health and physical health has been impacted by a virus. They've said recently, I think, that they've discounted long COVID. But I think long COVID is a reality for a lot of people.
I don't know who's discounted it, but I think it is a reality for a lot of people. But again, compared to other EU countries, we seem to have the slowest back-to-work recovery. Why do you think that is?
One of the issues is around like the levels of obesity that we have in comparison to other countries, and that can be a kind of comorbidity that makes other things worse and likelihood of recovery. It's really complicated, and it's one of those things that I don't think that honestly, one party has a complete answer to. What you've got to do is invest in the NHS, really give people who are away from the workplace the targeted, bespoke help that they need to get back into the workforce. And that, like, I really think that it requires the might of every department, from skills and upskilling and job opportunities. You know, the Conservative have an impressive record around job creation since 2010 to really get those people back into the workforce.
Should it be mission number one?
It should be.
Well, in terms of what Labour's missions are, well, their number one mission is growth, and if you have growth, you're going to have more jobs and better paid jobs. So, look, you know,
I've never tried that before. Growth.
Well, you haven't been very successful at it, the Conservative Party. I mean, yeah, you can have successful growth strategies, and you can have unsuccessful growth strategies like the ones we've had for the last 14 years. So, you know, let's be. I just think you should be really careful with this issue, because with some of the stuff that Mel Stride's been saying, it's like kind of, you know, they blamed COVID. They blamed Ukraine, they blamed everybody but themselves. Now they're blaming the British public. They're saying the British public's not working hard.
And you're saying it's Conservative government's fault. Why?
Well, because you've had austerity, which I think has a long-term impact on growth. You've had Brexit, which has a long-term impact on growth. You've had a government which looks inwards towards its own party rather than taking decisions in the national interest. I think that's a record of 14 years, and I don't think anyone can really dispute that our economy is worse than it was 14 years ago.
I was asking, what has that got to do with the people leaving the workforce?
Because what I'm saying is that some people like Mel Stride seem to be trying to blame the government's economic failure on the British people themselves, and I think that's a political mistake.
Okay, but hang on, you've talked about the things that have gone wrong. Why are people leaving the workforce? You seem to say that's about austerity? Or?
No, I'm saying that people are leaving the workforce for complicated reasons, and part of that is, you know, we have a very mean benefit system. Part of it is that we've got a misfunctioning NHS, which means that when you fall sick, you can't get better.
Anita,
there's a complicated answer to this, as you say, and I just think some of the Mel Stride language is actually in danger of, you know, appearing to blame the British people.
I don't have the answers
I'm going to let Anita
because they've said Wales is their blueprint for the NHS, and if you want to talk about waiting lists, you know, they're really high in Wales, much higher than in England.
Totally different challenges.
Just a response from you, Anita, and then we're going to move on.
I think we all agree that it's very complicated, and we're also agreed, honestly, that there isn't a silver bullet solution. And I sort of think that both parties, and the Labour in particular, should level with people about the complexities of some of these challenges, rather than pretending they're straightforward. Why don't we just reach for the bullet of growth? And have anyone thought about giving more money to the NHS as solutions to some of these complexities?
We're going to talk about something completely different, which is solar farms. A BBC News headline: Sunnica solar farm decision delayed on the Suffolk-Cambridgeshire border. Yes, this has been referred. I think Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, will be making a final decision. If it does go ahead, it will be the biggest solar farm in Europe. We're going to talk to Nick Wright, a farmer from the area, from Cambridgeshire. Hello to you. And his farmland would be part of this massive scheme. And you're against it. Why, Nick?
Yeah, good morning. Hi. Thank you very much for having me on the programme. Sunnica is 2,500 acres, and as you've just said, it will be 3 times larger than anything we have in the UK currently. It is all on highly productive irrigated arable land, 50% of which is best and most versatile land. The land is capable of growing potatoes, onions, maize, wheat, barley, sugar beet and rye. And if you take the equivalent 2,500 acres of Sunnica, it would produce per annum around 32,000 tonnes of produce. a cereal-only farm of the equivalent size would produce less than 7,000 tonnes. We all believe totally in the mix of between renewables, and solar is part of it, but we also believe that we have to try and do everything to achieve our 2050 net zero target. But we must protect our food self-sufficiency.
All right.
In 1984, we were 78% self-sufficient in food. In 2024, we're 60% self-sufficient, which means if we had to exist on our own food, we would run out at the beginning of August.
All right, Nick, I'm going to bring in the politicians just to respond. I mean, Angela, you're in favour, broadly speaking, of solar farms, and I think there was one
I support one in my constituency.
Can you convince Nick Wright, or do you think he has a point?
No, so I think he has a point, and the MPs in his area are very strongly opposed to solar farms being used on productive farmland. I think there is an argument for solar farms to be on unproductive land, and we've got to make sure that in anything we do, that it's not a blanket ban on solar farms. It has to be part of the energy mix to get towards net zero. And the particular solar farm that I support is to help the University of Surrey in my constituency meet its net zero goals by 2030.
Right. Well, let me get Barry's response, because if the government and if the country wants to hit net zero, surely, you know, all farming land has to be considered.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
No, absolutely not. The National Planning Policy Framework stipulates that it should only be, there's grading of agricultural land, and it should only be 3B and below that is available for renewables and solar panels to be put on it, because that's trying to keep the best agricultural land out of this equation. Now, I don't know this particular case that Nick's talking about, but it may well be that if he says the phrase is the most versatile and suitable agricultural land is being used, then that's something that should be looked at, and there's an ability of the local authority to refer this to Natural England to look and actually judge in the case whether it should be used or not.
So can I just get a quick answer from both of you? You would like the Secretary of State to reject this, then?
I'll leave that decision to the Secretary of State, because there will be particular issues in this location that need to be looked at separately from anywhere else in the country.
No, that's absolutely right. It must be looked on a case-by-case basis. I don't know the details, but the national policy is very clear that it should only be land that's 3B and below.
Right. I mean, Nick, there will be people watching who will say, you sound a little bit like, not in my backyard. I support the idea of solar farms, but I don't want it on my farmland. And there is an example of another farmer in a different area saying that actually solar farms became more profitable in the end, rather than sticking to arable farming, and diversification was important. What do you say to that?
I say that I'm talking about the big principle, which I think everyone is agreeing, is that, you know, with our food self-sufficiency targets falling, we simply cannot afford to lose this land. And the solar industry will say, well, this is only a temporary loss. You know, you lose it for 40 years. Well, I think we've got to all be pretty realistic that if you in 40 years' time, or 45, 50 years, when it's finally decommissioned, you know, the idea of this 2,500 acres just returning to agriculture, I think, is naive. So anyone making these decisions has to say, well, this land is lost forever. And I do not believe as a country we can lose irrigated, vegetable-producing land. The great thing about this type of land that we're farming is that it's resilient to climate change, or more resilient than others, in that we can collect water in the winter when it's very wet, put it on the land in the summer when it's very dry. We can grow the crops.
All right, I'm just going to show our viewers and our guests this headline in the Times. The King Charles planned solar panel farm at Sandringham. The project, part of the King's commitment to tackling climate change, would mean the estate produces its own green energy. Where are you, broadly, on this principle and decisions about where solar farms should go?
I think
I'm so sorry, Nick. I'm so sorry, Nick. I should have said that I'm talking to Tom, and I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
My apologies.
No, not at all.
I wouldn't pretend to have detailed views about grades of farmland. I do think we have to have a balance between conflicting priorities for this country. If we want to get clean energy, we are going to have to use some farmland for solar. That's a conflicting priority to food self-sufficiency, which seems to be a sort of wartime aspiration. We should be doing much more of our coastline. I mean, you know, in this my other new book, which I'm publishing this week on
we haven't done the
England,
first one yet. We'll do, yeah, all right. Other books.
Mark Steers and I talk about these different national myths we have, and one of them is, you know, our relationship with the sea. And that's really important that we use that myth, but not to go out and do global Britain and buccaneering and daring do, but use our coastline for floating wind farms. Now, that's a new relationship with the wind and the sea, which actually is about meeting a national priority and a challenge of today, not yesterday. So I think solar panels and solar wind and solar farms are an important part of the mix, and we have to be careful we're not going to get back in a place where we didn't have, you know, any wind farms on land because there was an effective ban because of political priorities elsewhere.
I agree with everything that Angela said about creating a balance, right? We absolutely want more solar, but we want it in the right places. And a lot of objections come at a local level. I'm a former local councillor, because people don't feel they're consulted and they don't feel like the solution is appropriate for the area. We know that to get to net zero, it's going to be a monumental challenge, and the public has to come with us at every step of the way. And so it's more important than ever that we make the cases in the right places so they feel there is a reason for them to go for one solution over another.
Nick, before we let you go, which way do you think the decision will go in terms of the Secretary of State?
Well, you know, if I'm being optimistic, I'm thinking that, and judging by what you've all said this morning, I think it backs up the idea that, you know, solar in the right places. And I think Sonica is one of the worst examples of solar in the wrong place. And that's looking on national scale. I'm not talking about all the smaller local issues. And just to point out that, you know, in this scheme, both, it's so large, 2 MPs are against it because it ranges 2 constituencies, 2 county councils, 2 district councils, 13 parish councils, 2 town councils, and well over 1,200 people wrote very complicated representations into the examiners during the examination process. So it is really, these processes, it has to work in tandem. You know, I think the Sandringham scheme is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
All right. Well, let me just read.
To work in tandem.
Well, let me just read part of the statement from the company, because Sonica denies claims that half of the proposed solar park would be on the highest quality agricultural land. They say only 4% of it would cover prime arable land, and that the solar farm would power 172,000 homes and create 1,500 jobs during construction. Anyway, we will await a decision from the Secretary of State. Nick Wright, thank you very much for talking to us today. Let's talk about Labour, because you've already preempted the fact. Yes, you've written a book about Keir Starmer. We've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in about 12, 13 minutes' time, when the Labour leader will question Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. And the poll ratings have been pretty consistent. It suggests that Labour's on course to win a majority at the next general election. But what about the Labour leader himself? Boring is one of the words that's been used to describe him by people in focus groups. So can he seal the deal with the electorate? Let's talk to Jo Twyman, pollster, co-founder and director of Delta Poll. Hello to you, Jo. Labour's latest average poll rating is 44 points to the Conservatives' 23, according to the BBC's poll tracker. How does Keir Starmer fare personally?
Well, personally, he is, perhaps ironically, fluctuating around net zero. In Delta Poll's most recent poll, he is on +7 net satisfaction. Now, it does depend on how you ask the question. We ask whether people think each of the leaders is doing well or badly in their job, but +7 is near the upper end of where he's been. Over the last 12 months, he's been as high as +11 and as low as -11, but pretty consistent along that way. Nearly half, 47%, think that he's doing well, including more than 7 in 10 Labour voters. And I think the crucial point here is not so much about Keir Starmer's performance in absolute terms, but his performance relative to Rishi Sunak. On the same figures, Rishi Sunak is on -29, and that is up from a low of -42. But you still have more than 6 in 10 thinking that he's doing badly.
What do voters say about Keir Starmer in focus groups?
Well, when we've run surveys, we've found that the most important thing is that actually a lot of people still don't know. Around 1 in 6 people, depending on which question you ask, say they don't know whether Keir Starmer is this or that. But pluralities do think that he can understand the problems of ordinary people and that, crucially, he unites his party. But on the negative side, people believe that he represents more of the same and has no real vision for the future. But again, it's worth pointing out that on all of those measures and many others, he is significantly ahead of Rishi Sunak.
Well, just stay with us and let's go to you, Tom, because you've written this 400-page or so biography about Keir Starmer. Why should the public be interested in him? And respond to what you just heard there from Jo.
Well, I think the public should be interested in him because he's very likely to be the next Prime Minister. And I think Jo's right that in many ways Keir Starmer's the least unpopular leader at the moment. And I think he's also right that Keir Starmer's has struggled somehow to get his personality across. He struggled to cut through. People don't know who he is. Sometimes it does take a book, and that's one of the reasons he cooperated with this book as much as he did. I think one of the paradoxes about politics at the moment, though, is every poll I read says that people don't like politicians, and yet almost everyone I know in politics wrings their hands and says they wish Keir Starmer could be a bit more political. And I think the truth about this guy is he isn't really a typical politician. He doesn't like politics. He doesn't like PMQs, particularly, you know.
Well, isn't that problematic, Tom?
Well, no, well, it may, in some ways it is, yeah, in that he doesn't do some of the things that politicians usually do. But I think people in journalism and people in politics need to kind of get used to a slightly different style, because the challenges facing this country are complicated, solutions are going to be complicated, and he is quite complicated in a way that political leaders aren't usually allowed to be, with their tight backstories and their visions. And so it does sometimes take a book to explain who someone is.
Right. Are you going to read the book to find out?
No, I mean, I've read extracts. It looks very intriguing, and I'm sure I will. And I think...
well, stocks last.
Enough with the promotion. Enough with the promotion.
I think there are some really interesting points there that Tom just made, really, about the fact that people don't really know who Starmer is, and there's a lot more defining that I'm sure Starmer will want and try to do. But I think there's a fundamental point about politics, right? People don't like politicians, but they basically vote for politicians so they can do the politics, so the public don't have to think about it. So as much as they don't want to feel as though politicians are just kind of doing their political thing, actually being good at politics, being political, is actually quite important. Like, you're not a policy wonk. You are someone who has to drive and create a vision to bring people along with you, not just follow where public opinion is, to be able to diagnose the problems of the country and have a vision for solving them. And at the moment, it feels a lot like Keir's answers are very much like, have you ever heard of competence? We're going to try that. Looking at how they tried to handle the £28 billion spending on renewable, I'm not sure I have the confidence that really, like, what Keir Starmer's offering is some kind of revolution in competence that's going to solve some of these thorny issues that we've rightly talked about today.
I think that's very interesting, because, you know, in some ways he doesn't have the political skills we associate with politicians, and yet he's doing something right. I mean, he's taken a party that was 20 points behind and is now leading a party that's 20 points ahead. And, yeah, I worked for Ed Miliband, and I don't think we would be 20 points ahead if Ed was leader, as much as I love him and so on. I certainly don't think we would be 20 points ahead if Jeremy Corbyn, who was trusted neither with national security or the nation's finances, was leader. So to de-scarify Labour at the speed with which he's done it is actually quite extraordinary. And then to be described as dull and boring is maybe a political skill. To actually, you know, to be seen as stolid and reassuring when you're changing the party at breakneck speed. So maybe that's the best way to change the country, not to have these big radical visions, but just get on with it and do it. And that's kind of what he's done with the Labour Party.
Jo, do you want to respond to that point? And also, you mentioned this idea of a unified... He's turned the party round, unified it more since Jeremy Corbyn's time. Does that come up in focus groups with voters?
Certainly the fact that Keir Starmer has been able to unify the party, or it's perceived as unified under his leadership, is very much a positive that comes through in a lot of the research, and he has certainly been successful in that. But I think it's important not to confuse correlation with causation, as we say. And Keir Starmer has done very well in terms of his personal rating, and his party has done very well. But a lot of that can be attributed to the failures of the Conservative Party, and particularly the failures of consecutive Conservative leaders rather than specific things that Labour and their leaders have done.
Right, you were nodding there, but I presume not at the failures of the Conservative Party,
no,
Conservative
at
governments.
The correlation, causation.
Well, but I mean, it is helped, isn't it, that Rishi Sunak's ratings are through the floor, and the Conservative Party and government are therefore struggling in the polls, not just as a result of Rishi Sunak's, I don't know what comes first, but the combined or the combination of the two. No wonder Keir Starmer's doing well.
I think in the Westminster bubble we're absolutely obsessed by polls, and, you know, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I was looking at them. But what I'm finding as we get closer and closer to a general election, people are actually, their minds are starting to be focused.
You think they're going to reverse, do you?
No, I just think there'll be a natural narrowing in the polls. I'm picking that up already on the doorstep when I'm out talking to people. Well, I haven't read Tom's book, but there are other books.
You really must.
There are other books that are being published at the moment that I'm probably not going to get time to read either.
All right, well, let me go back to Jo, because you were smiling there as Angela said. It's all going to tighten and change as we get closer to the general election, whenever that's going to be. Jo, do you agree?
By historical standards, we would expect that. Let's go back to the mid-1990s. Tony Blair was on plus 43 in the ratings then, and more than 6 in 10 thought he was doing a good job. And at one point, Labour were on more than 57% in the vote. The talk then was that the Conservatives would be completely wiped out, as they have been in Canada. But they still won 165 seats, more than 90 of which had not changed hands since the Second World War. And part of that was because the polls did contract and the lead was double figures, but nothing like what it had been in the run-up to the election. But the economic situation had improved going into that election. Indeed, Tony Blair benefited from that. It will be interesting to see whether a similar narrowing happens this time if the economic situation is not perceived to be improving.
Barry?
Well, Jo, I don't know whether you know this, but you're talking to the man who about 10 years ago was voted by his colleagues as the most boring man in Parliament.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
So I welcome what Tom was saying about boring.
Well,
but I think, for me, it's always been about policy. Politics is about policy.
Barry, it is also about personality, isn't it, as well?
It's about policies that affect people's lives. Now, I agree with what Anita said, that you need a vision, OK? And you need to be able to project a vision. But if that vision is contentless, then it's not a vision at all, it's a dream. And what we have to be able to do is to identify the policies that people look at and they say, you know, that would actually make a difference to me.
Which policies are those so far?
Well, look, I would say what we talked about earlier, and spending an additional billion to make sure that we got that million extra people back into work. That makes a difference. The free school meals for children that Sadiq Khan, as Mayor of London, is piloting in London, that's going to make a huge difference to families in my constituency. You know, I have some of the poorest people in London in my constituency.
Should wealthy families get subsidised free school meals?
Look, I think if you make benefits universal, and Angela, you accept a system in which many of the benefits, whether it's child benefit or so on, are universal, that reduces the stigma. It takes away the stigma, and that's really important for families who want these things for their children. So I think these are the sort of policies that people can look at and say, wow, yeah, that is actually going to change my life. It's going to change my child's life.
All right,
and that's the sort of vision we need to project.
I'm going to say goodbye and thank you to Jo Twyman for joining us, because Prime Minister's Questions is coming up in about 2 or 3 minutes' time. To go back to the personality policy issue that we've been discussing when it comes to Keir Starmer, and to some extent Rishi Sunak, because he is also seen as more of a technocrat than a politician in that real way. Has that been part of his problem, Anita?
I think that his inheritance was extraordinarily difficult, and I think that actually it was almost sort of, here is an impossible question, here is an impossible problem, and can you solve all of them? And I think actually, if you look at Rishi Sunak's numbers, for instance, when he was Chancellor, which newsflash is an easier job.
That's because he was paying everybody. Well, it was paying everybody's wages during
furlough. It's just an easier job than being Prime Minister. Being leader of the opposition is an easier job than being Prime Minister. Being leader of the opposition after a really challenging couple of years is easier than being Prime Minister. newsflash. And so I kind of think there is a lack of experience actually on both sides here, and particularly on Keir's, that's going to make this period really challenging.
Look, Anita, when Rishi Sunak took over, many people thought he was going to contest the same piece of territory that Keir Starmer had carved out of integrity and competence and decency. The reason why he's drifted off into the sort of marshlands of the Tory fringes at the moment is because he's not in control of his party. The difference between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak is Keir Starmer's changed his party, he's got control of his party, and he now can look outwards to the electorate rather than to that rather weird membership you've got, which I think has done for 4 consecutive leaders and will do for this one too.
Right, marshlands of Tory party policies. I mean, the party's split every which way. I mean, we had Liz Truss, one of the former Prime Ministers, Conservative former Prime Ministers. She's also written a book about saving the West, standing up, not backing the smoking ban. I mean, did you welcome her intervention? Have you welcomed her intervention back in politics?
I think that the Prime Minister needs to be given space to be able to get on and keep doing the things that he's doing, sticking to the plan that is actually working, and the economy is turning a corner. And we will see the polls tighten in reference to speaking to Jo earlier. I think it's interesting talking about Keir Starmer getting control of his party. If you look back to the SNP Opposition Day debate and the absolute lengths that he went to in order to be able to...
For PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, we are joined today in the gallery by postmasters caught up in the Horizon IT scandal. It is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our history, and that is why we've introduced a bill to quash convictions, delivered schemes to ensure swift compensation, and established an independent inquiry. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Sir Lane Saxon.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree towns like Barnstaple, the main transport hub in North Devon serving hundreds of square miles, should have a fully functioning bus station, as Lib Dem run North Devon Council has not reopened ours since the pandemic, leaving residents out in the cold with no public facilities? As people start to feel the difference with tax cuts and falling inflation, does he agree we should be making it easier for people to use the bus, come to town and support Barnstable's local economy? And will my right honourable friend join me in calling on the Lib Dems to get on with reopening the bus station?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know how vital bus services are for communities right across the country. That's why we're providing Devon with £17 million to deliver better bus services, and we introduced the £2 fare bus cap. But I know my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, was recently visiting my honourable friend, seeing the benefits of reopening Barnstable bus station, and it's clear that the local Liberal Democrats should just get on and do it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I too welcome the postmasters in the gallery in their quest for justice? And Mr. Speaker, this week we marked 35 years since the disaster at Hillsborough, and the enduring courage and determination of the families must be marked by the passing of a Hillsborough law. Mr. Speaker, we also lost Lord Richard Rosser, a lifelong member of the Labour Party. He will be greatly missed, and our thoughts are with his wife Sheena, his family and friends. Mr. Speaker, I'm privileged to be the proud owner of a copy of the former Prime Minister's new book. It's a rare, unsigned copy. It's the only unsigned copy. It's quite the read. She claims the Tory party's disastrous kamikaze budget that triggered chaos for millions was, her words, the happiest moment of her premiership. Has the Prime Minister met anyone with a mortgage who agrees?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all I'd say is he ought to spend a bit less time reading that book and a bit more time reading the Deputy Leader's tax advice.
I think we'll have less talking. I want to get through PMQs. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. We've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working-class woman. And the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, has a long list of people to blame for the economic misery. They don't want to hear it. They made her Prime Minister, and millions of people are paying the price. She's got a long list of people to blame. She blames the Governor of the Bank of England, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility. The American President is blamed at one point. We even learned that the poor old lettuce was part of the deep state. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's actually much simpler than that? It was the Tories' unfunded tax cuts, tens of billions of pounds of unfunded tax cut, that crashed the economy and left millions paying more on their mortgages, wasn't it?
Mr. Speaker, everyone knows that 2 years ago I wasn't afraid to repeatedly warn about what her economic policies would lead to, even if it wasn't what people wanted to hear at the time. Mr. Speaker, I was right then, but I'm also right now when I say that his economic policies would be a disaster for Britain. He would send inflation up, mortgages up, and taxes up, and working people would pay the price.
Appreciate the Prime Minister having the stomach to say it out loud, but everyone knows it's the Tory party's obsession with wild, unfunded tax cut that crashed the economy. We know it, he knows it, they know it, and the whole country is living it. So when is he finally going to learn the lesson from his predecessor's mistakes and explain where the money is coming from for his own completely unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance?
Mr. Speaker, when my predecessor was running for leader, to use his words, I did have the stomach to argue out loud about her economic policies, had the conviction to say that they were wrong. But not once, but twice, he tried to make his predecessor Prime Minister. Despite him opposing NATO and Trident, ignoring anti-Semitism and siding with our enemies. It's clear what he did. He put his own interests ahead of Britain's.
I think actually when he was running for Prime Minister, for leader, he was explaining how he's funneling money from poor areas to pay it into richer areas. We know what his record is. I notice he's not denying the £46 billion promise to scrap the national insurance, but he's refusing to say where the money will come from. And we've been trying for months to get to the bottom of this. So now's his chance. No more spin, no more waffle, no more diversion. I know that'll be difficult. He can either, Mr. Speaker, this is the choice, he can either cut state pension or the NHS that national insurance funds, that's route one, or he can put up income tax. Which one is it?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've just cut taxes by £900 for a typical worker. We've delivered the biggest tax cut for businesses since the 1980s. But while we're cutting taxes, Labour is already putting them up. In Wales, putting up taxes right now for small businesses. In Birmingham, putting up council tax by 21%. And in London, his mayor has put up taxes by 70%, Mr. Speaker. And this is just a glimpse of what they'd do if they got in power. A few weeks ago, he finally admitted it to The Sun. What would he say he would do? I quote, he said, "We would put up taxes." It's always the same, Mr. Speaker. Higher taxes and working people paying the price.
No single politician has ever put tax up more times than he has. But Mr. Speaker, just hang on, because he was given the chance. He was just given the chance to rule out cutting the NHS or state pensions to pay for scrapping national insurance. No, I was a lawyer long enough to know when someone's avoiding the question. So I I'm going to give him another chance. Will he now rule out cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or putting up taxes to pay for his unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance? Which is it?
Mr. Speaker, I make absolutely no apology about wanting to end the unfairness of the double taxation on work, Mr. Speaker. The NHS is receiving record funding under this Conservative government. Pensioners have just received a £900 increase under this government. But if he wants to talk about tax, let's have a look at what Labour's brand newly appointed tax advisor has to say. This advisor thinks that supporting pensioners is a complete disgrace, Mr. Speaker. He believes their free TV licences are ridiculous. And if it wasn't bad enough, this advisor has called for increases in income tax, in national insurance and VAT. It all makes sense now. That's who the Shadow Chancellor's been copying and pasting from.
So this is genuinely extraordinary. Two chances to rule out, Mr. Speaker, two chances to rule out cuts to state pension, cuts to the NHS, or income tax rises to fund his promise to abolish national insurance.
Order. Mr. Holden, I want you to set a good example, not a bad one. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this really matters. He's had two chances to rule out these cuts to NHS, cuts to tax or pensions or tax rise. This matters to millions of people watching who want to know what's going to happen to their NHS and pensions. It really does matter to millions of people who are watching. So I'll be really generous now and give him one last chance. Very simple, very clear. Is his £46 billion promise to abolish national insurance being paid for by cuts to the NHS, cuts to the state pension, or yet another Tory tax rise?
Mr. Speaker, he's really got to keep up, Mr. Speaker, right? It's this government that's just delivered a £900 increase to the state pension. It's this government that's already committed to the triple lock for the next Parliament. He had 6 opportunities. I didn't think I heard him say that, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the NHS, you'd much rather be treated in Conservative-run NHS in England, not the Labour-run NHS in Wales, Mr. Speaker. But it's another week where all we heard is political sniping, Mr. Speaker, not a word about their plans for the country. He's failed to acknowledge that since we last met, taxes have been cut by £900, state pensions gone up, free childcare has been expanded, wages have risen for 9 months in a row, Mr. Speaker, and just today, inflation down again to 3.2%. Our plan is working and the Conservatives are delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, you will not be surprised to learn that I very much welcome the £20 million allocated to Carlton in my Gedling constituency as part of the long-term plan for towns. But I'm very eager to see that this money is spent according to local wishes. I know there'll be consultations following the setting up of the Towns Board, so will my right honourable friend join me in urging Carlton residents to take part in those forthcoming consultations, to make sure their voices are heard and to ensure that this money is spent where the people want?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of the residents of Carlton. Our long-term plan for towns means that 75 towns across the country, including Carlton, will benefit from £20 million each to invest in their local area. But crucially, as he said, that will be in the hands of local people deciding on their priorities for the place that we live, whether it's regenerating local high streets, investing in parks and green spaces, or tackling antisocial behaviour. We're levelling up across the country, and he deserves enormous praise for his role in securing that investment.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, a former Prime Minister who oversaw a financial crash before being unceremoniously turfed from office told the public the truth, and I'm not referring to that one, Mr. Speaker, because on Monday, Gordon Brown told the people of these Isles that the forces pulling Britain apart are greater than the forces holding it together. So maybe the Prime Minister can find some time this afternoon to perhaps agree with just one of his predecessors.
Well, Mr. Speaker, where I do agree with my predecessor very strongly is that Scotland would be far stronger inside the United Kingdom.
Stephen Flynn. Mr. Speaker, of course, where Gordon Brown was also correct was in stating that Scottish independence is not simply off the agenda. And indeed, those remarks were echoed just yesterday by the General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress, who stated that it remains an unresolved issue, Mr. Speaker, before going on to state, and I confirm, and they may laugh at her, but she said, that can be a very dangerous place to end up in when you are not allowing people to express their wishes in a democratic manner. So may I ask the Prime Minister, does he welcome the fulsome, wholehearted and warm support of the Labour Party in denying the people of Scotland that opportunity to have a say over their own future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we did have a democratic vote on that topic, but what I would suggest to the SNP is that rather than obsessing about independence and indeed wasting time cracking down on free speech and trying to lock up J.K. Rowling, he should focus on what the people of Scotland actually care about: schools, hospitals, jobs and our new tax cuts.
Name Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I abhor a two-tier policing system, and we must ensure that everyone's treated equally under the rule of law. The Labour Police and Crime Commissioner who investigated the Beergate scandal handed their police chief constable a new 3-year contract whilst the investigation into the Labour Party leader and deputy leader was ongoing. Now, 2 former Labour MPs are overseeing the force due to investigate the opposition deputy leader. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that complete transparency throughout this investigation is of the utmost importance?
Yeah, my right honourable friend makes an important point. A key principle of our country is that there are the same rules for everyone. And when it comes to this topic, I do think the Labour leader should show some leadership. To avoid stop reading the legal advice, simply just publish it and get a grip of the situation. And it says a lot about his priorities, that when it comes to his famed legal expertise, he's more than happy to help defend Hizbut Tahrir, but refuses to help his own deputy leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recently published Canova report makes it absolutely clear that the IRA was riddled with British agents from top to bottom. Those agents were involved in abduction, torture and murder of British and Irish citizens. The British government, successive British governments, knew all about it and did nothing. The report also calls for an apology from the government to those victims. Will the Prime Minister take this opportunity now to make that apology?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman will know, this is an interim report, as the Secretary of State has laid out. We can't comment on the findings until we get the final report, but we would never condone wrongdoing where there is evidence of this. But I will say this also, because it's not said enough. The overwhelming majority of the police, armed forces and intelligence services served with great distinction. They defended democracy in the face of some horrendous violence, and without their service and their sacrifice, there would have been no peace process. They helped ensure that the future of Northern Ireland will never be decided by violence, but by the consent of its people.
Sir Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? We don't agree on everything, but we do agree on this, that if anyone wants to see why this government has introduced strong mayors, they need only look to Ben Houchen in the Tees Valley. Because from saving our airport to introducing our free port to bringing steelmaking back, Ben delivers. And does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best thing that Ben has done is do this without charging any mayoral tax, which his Labour opponent would need to do to fund his unfunded spending plans?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the great work of Ben Houchen, and I share his concerns about the pledges of the Labour candidate. Over £130 million of unfunded spending, showing that Labour can't be trusted. And we all see the results of this, Mr. Speaker, in Labour-run Birmingham. Taxes going up by 20%. And that is the story of what Labour in local government means. Working people paying the price, and it's exactly why he and I completely agree on this. The people of Teesside should vote Ben Houchen and vote Conservative.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year in Shropshire, 10,000 people waited for more than 24 hours in A&E. That's 10,000 people over 65 waiting on hard plastic chairs or in trolleys in our accident and emergency department. The Prime Minister tells us he's got a plan for the NHS, but what people in North Shropshire want to know is how long they are going to have to wait for him to get on and fix the issues where we are.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with the record funding that we're putting into the NHS, our urgent emergency care plan is delivering more ambulances, more beds, but also faster discharge through our hospitals to speed the flow, and that plan is working. Of course, there's more to do, but this winter we saw ambulance and A&E waiting times improve from the year before for the first time in many years, and if we stick to the plan, we'll continue to deliver improvement for her constituents and everyone else.
Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, somebody earning £15,000 a year paid £1,700 in income tax. Today, somebody earning £15,000 a year pays less than £500 of tax. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that this has helped create jobs, growth and self-reliance?
My honourable friend is quite right, and because of our plan, the economy, after a tough few years, has indeed turned the corner. Inflation has fallen from over 11% to 3.2%. It's forecast to return back to target in just a few months, a year ahead of expectations. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've been able to cut people's taxes, a tax cut, as he mentioned, worth £900 for an average worker, which, by the way, is part of our plan to end the long-term unfairness of the double taxation on work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, my constituent Juliana was drugged and raped by her then boyfriend. After his conviction, Juliana was advised that reading a transcript of his trial would help her to come to terms with her experience. But when she requested that transcript, she was told that she would have to pay more than £7,000. Astonishingly, Juliana is not alone. I have heard about victims who have been quoted fees of up to £22,000 just to read trial transcripts that are part of their own story. Mr. Speaker, justice should not have a price tag. The Liberal Democrats' amendment to the Victims Bill would give all victims the right to read sentencing remarks and summings up free of charge. Juliana is here in the gallery today, and she asks if the Prime Minister will support that amendment. Will he look her in the eye and say yes?
Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely sorry to hear about Juliana's case, and my sympathies with her and indeed her family. We are committed to improving victims' access to court transcripts to help them move on and rebuild their lives. We already offer a free service to families of homicide victims, for example, and that's why we have already committed to a one-year pilot to help identify the current demand, inform our next steps, and alongside this, we're actively looking at other options to immediately reduce the costs.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, Bracknell Forest Council has a particular challenge with special educational needs, and I'm keen to support them. I am grateful to the Government for the recent SEND review, the significant increase in resources and the bespoke safety valve programme for Bracknell, but additional school places are needed now. Could the Prime Minister please agree today to release the funding for our new SEN units at Sandhurst and Edgebarrow schools and commit to fully funding up front our new SEN school in Crowthorne?
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting how Bracknell Forest's local authority has worked positively with the department through the safety valve programme, and as part of that agreement, over the next few years the council will receive £16 million in extra funding to provide the vital education that my honourable friend's constituents deserve. I'm told that the department is still reviewing capital bids for the safety valve programme, but they will be in touch with local authorities directly as soon as possible.
Daniel Zachner.
In the exchanges earlier, we didn't hear much of a defence from the Prime Minister of his predecessor, so perhaps he could tell the House, what does he consider to be her greatest achievement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, while the party opposite were busy trying to take us back into the EU and reverse the referendum result, my predecessor was signing trade deals around the world, which have now meant, Mr. Speaker, that Brexit Britain has overtaken the Netherlands, France and Japan to become the fourth largest exporter in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Claire Massey, and one of her two children almost lost their lives in a fire at her home in February 2023. Since then, Claire has been a victim of bullying by aggressive claims handlers and negligent and unprofessional conduct, including violating a policy and withdrawing alternative accommodation by the insurer, Policy Expert, part of the accredited Insurance Europe Group and Limited Trinity Claims Management. Claire has raised institutional failings with the Financial Conduct Authority, which appears toothless. She's also successfully raised individual issues with the Financial Ombudsman, but the delaying tactics of the insurance means she is no closer to a resolution. Claire is here in the gallery today and is asking, will the Prime Minister meet with her and me to look at how we can better protect consumers against bad practices in the insurance industry? And does he agree with me that it is time to establish an Office of the Whistleblower?
My honourable friend is an excellent campaigner on behalf of her constituent, and can I extend my sympathies to Claire and her family. Whilst I can't comment on individual cases, I'm sure she'll understand, I know that the Financial Conduct Authority does have the powers that it needs to take action against firms that breach its rules, and further customers can contact the Financial Ombudsman Service, whose decisions are binding on insurers. But I will immediately ensure that the relevant minister meets with my honourable friend to look more closely at the specific issue and the case that she raises.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament Mykola Stefanchuk is in the public gallery this afternoon. I'm sure we all wish to welcome him and wish Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. Mykola has told me that Ukraine has the people, Ukraine has the courage, but Ukraine does not currently have the weapons and the air defence to secure her freedom. In light of today's Russian attack on Chernihiv this morning, which has killed at least 10 and injured many more, can I ask the Prime Minister, will he respond to President Zelensky's statement that this would not have happened if Ukraine had received sufficient air defence equipment?
Mr. Speaker, it was a pleasure to address members of the Ukrainian Parliament when I visited Ukraine earlier this year. Indeed, it was my first foreign visit of the year. I was the first foreign leader to visit Ukraine and President Zelensky to demonstrate our strong support for the Ukrainian people at their moment of struggle against Russian aggression. We've increased the amount of support that we've given to Ukraine this year, indeed the first major country to do so, and a big part of that support concerns air defence, where we have led in supporting Ukraine's efforts. We'll continue to do so, and also continue to encourage other countries around the world to step up and match our leadership, because we all want to see a future for Ukraine based on freedom from tyranny.
Mr. Speaker, on a recent visit to Pimlico in my constituency, the Prime Minister heard directly from local people concerned about the eye-watering rise in violent crime and robberies. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the London Labour Mayor has failed to take advantage of extra government funding to recruit more police, and that on the 2nd of May, Londoners can send him a very clear message: he's let them down?
Mr. Speaker, Sadiq Khan is failing London. While burglary is down across England, it's up in London. Violent crime down across England, but up in London. And the Labour Mayor is the only one of 43 police and crime commissioners to have missed his police recruitment target. Londoners will have a chance, Mr. Speaker, to cast their vote on the 2nd of May, and I hope that they kick him out, because we all know they'll be safer with Susan Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local community is reeling from the discovery of 35 bodies and unidentifiable cremated ashes at a local funeral home. Their pain has been made worse when they realise the funeral plans they'd used their life savings for were fake. Does the Prime Minister agree that in these unique and limited circumstances, banks should offer discretion when deciding if chargeback applies to payment refunds?
Can I express my sympathies to the families affected by the case that the Honourable Lady raises? I believe that Ministry of Justice are urgently looking at the matter that she's raised. I'll ensure that someone gets in touch with her as soon as possible.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Robotic surgery allows laparoscopic surgery to be performed with increased precision, flexibility and control. This can result in reduced patient complication rates, reduced length of stay in hospital and reduced hospital readmissions. However, there is currently no robotic surgery provision in Cornwall. As a result, residents of Cornwall have to travel to Devon for robotic procedures, a journey of more than 80 miles, 120 miles if you're from Elderslie, for West Cornwall and Elderslie residents. Will my friend the PM the Prime Minister commit to ring-fence capital funding for Cornwall to establish a robotic surgery service and address the health inequalities our constituents have lived with for far too long?
Can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting the potential of this innovative technology for patient care. I'm delighted to see that more generally Cornwall is benefiting from our new hospital programme, providing a new women's and children's hospital in the centre of Royal Cornwall, which he and I discussed when I was last with him. But I can also tell him that NHS England are actively exploring opportunities to expand robotic-assisted surgery. Any decisions on funding new allocations will factor in health inequalities, such as areas with less access to robots today, and I will ensure that the current access to robotic surgery in my honourable friend's local community is appropriately considered by the relevant Health Minister.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told us on Monday that he was off to make a telephone call to Mr. Netanyahu to urge restraint on a government that has killed and maimed well over 100,000 people in 6 months, 72% of them women and children. Can you tell us how the telephone call went and what he will do if his advice is not taken and an unrestrained war begins?
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who thanked the UK for their support of Israel's security over the weekend. We also discussed the situation and how Iran is isolated on the world stage, and also I made the point to him that significant escalation is not in anyone's interest, and it's a time for calm heads to prevail. I also reiterated our concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, where I welcome the statements and commitments that the Israeli government have made about significantly increasing aid into Gaza, and now we need to see those commitments delivered.
Nigel Mills.
Thank you. The residents in Smalley and Denby are now faced by 2 huge solar farm applications with only a 500-metre gap between them. And both sites are wholly in the Greenbelt. So would the Prime Minister agree we should change planning guidance to make it absolutely clear that productive farms in the Greenbelt are not the right place for solar farms, and the investment and the time being spent should go on sites that might be appropriate, like car parks or brownfield land or roofs of industrial buildings, rather than wasting people's time and causing fear like this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right that particularly at a time of increased geopolitical risk, we must protect our nation's food security and therefore our most valuable agricultural land. We do want to see more solar, which is one of the cheapest forms of energy, but, as he said, on brownfield sites, rooftops, and away from our best agricultural land. And that's why our recently published National Infrastructure Planning Rules set out the requirement for solar not to be placed on what is described as best and most valuable versatile land where possible. The Energy and Environment Secretaries are ensuring that developers and planning authorities strike the right balance so that we can deliver what he wants, which is more British food grown here at home.
Catherine McKinnell.
Out recently with Chris McEwen, the mayoral candidate in Teesside, it was clear that residents are really worried about crime. Levels in Tory-run Teesside are some of the highest in the country. Residential burglary rate is 52% higher than anywhere else in the country. When will the Prime Minister realise that he's not only lost control of his party, but of crime in this country too?
Mr. Speaker, what a joke, right? But we've got police and crime commissioner elections across the country, and the honourable lady really should look at the record. Under this government, crime has been cut by 50%. 20,000 more police officers. But here are the facts, and this is why it's so extraordinary to hear what she said. People with a Labour police and crime commissioner are more likely to be victims of burglary and twice as likely to be victims of robbery. The facts completely speak for themselves. Vote Conservatives for safer streets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every month, my constituency, the Labour-run Warrington Council, spend nearly £4.5 million on interest payments to cover their £1.8 billion debt. Borrowing they've used to spend on an energy company that went bust, offices in Birmingham and Manchester, and even a business park that they purchased through an offshore company, presumably to avoid paying tax. Does the Prime Minister agree with me? It's time to send in the inspectors. Warrington Council has gone too far in its money-making schemes, and local councils should focus on delivering great services, and the way to achieve that is vote Conservative on the 2nd of May.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this year the government announced a further £600 million in extra funding for local councils, a real terms increase as it has done every single year of this Parliament. But we all know what happens when Labour are in charge, whether it is racking up debt in Warrington, as my honourable friend said, the 21% council tax increase in Labour-run Birmingham, or indeed slashing services in Nottingham, or, as I just said, higher crime on average in each Labour Police and Crime Commissioner area. It's crystal clear, Mr. Speaker, that whenever Labour are in charge, it's working people that pay the price.
Mr. Speaker, while 64,000 people are on the waiting list for a council house in the West Midlands, families are living in hotels, in cold and damp homes and mouldy flats. The Mayor of the West Midlands, Andy Street, has built 46 social homes in 8 years. Does the Prime Minister think that is good enough?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, Andy Street is absolutely delivering for the West Midlands. Unlike the Labour Mayor in London, he's delivered on all his housing targets, in fact. But it's a Labour-run council in Birmingham that's imposing on her constituents and others a 21% council tax rise. And what are they getting in exchange for that? 600 job losses, cuts to services, and on some streets, they're even turning off the lights, Mr. Speaker. I tell you, what Labour have done to Birmingham, the Conservatives will never let them do to Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I just ask the Prime Minister to thank his right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, for further meetings with Hitachi this morning, indeed with the union representatives. We're all glad to see what's happened with Alstom yesterday, but it's important that we do the same to support the factories up at Hitachi in Aycliffe.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his role in championing the rail industry in the UK. As he rightly said, the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State have been actively engaged with companies to ensure we have a robust supply chain. And as he knows, we're investing record amounts in rail investment, particularly in the north, and we're pleased to see that that's being delivered.
Question, Nasha.
Well, we're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there. The Speaker, I think, is calling one more. And let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, the Trade Minister, Greg Hands, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, and Henry Zeffman, the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent. Welcome to all of you. And who knew local elections are coming along? Lots of questions about that at Prime Minister's questions. But let's start with what Keir Starmer wanted to focus on. He couldn't resist bringing up, if you like, perhaps in his words, the spectre of Liz Truss, predecessor to Rishi Sunak. Her economic record and what Labour said resulted in crashing the economy. What was interesting was Rishi Sunak's response.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, Liz Truss didn't get that many sessions of Prime Minister's questions when she was Prime Minister, but she managed to dominate this one today. I mean, people in the Labour Party I speak to have been delighted with her media tour, plugging her book this week, because one of the things they want to do, not just in advance of the local elections in a couple of weeks, but the general election whenever it comes later this year, is try to tie the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak's Conservatives, to the various Conservative Prime Ministers who went before, including Liz Truss. Now, strikingly, as you say, I thought Rishi Sunak repudiated his predecessor much more firmly than he ever has done when he's been baited into that sort of thing before since he became Prime Minister. I guess that's because when he became Prime Minister, his political imperative really was to try and unify a very fractious party because ultimately he'd just lost a very divisive leadership election. But clearly now he's decided, probably because he's pretty annoyed with what she's been up to this week, he's decided that he can go after her, and he tried to use it to make an argument about Keir Starmer. That was one of the interesting political pivots. He said he was right to warn about her economic plans, and then he said, and I'm right also to warn about Keir Starmer's economic plans.
Do you welcome, Greg Hands, Liz Truss's contribution to the political debate this week, or is her return damaging to Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party's brand?
Well, first of all, I think it was an excellent performance by Rishi Sunak across PMQs today. I think it was the best so far.
Good.
And really good, fired-up Conservative backbenchers as well.
And the answer to my question?
The answer to the question is that I thought the contrast that Rishi Sunak drew between the way he had responded to his predecessor with how Keir Starmer had backed Jeremy Corbyn. So reminding us, of course, in the summer of 2022, that Rishi Sunak was warning well before pretty much anybody else about the dangers of Liz Truss's economic policies, in contrast to Keir Starmer, who was backing Jeremy Corbyn not just once, but twice to be our Prime Minister.
Wes?
Keir Starmer has fundamentally changed the Labour Party. If Rishi Sunak wants some advice on leadership and how to deal with a predecessor that is causing difficulties and embarrassment and humiliation for your party, look at the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is no longer a Labour MP, because when Keir said he was going to tackle anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and people who downplayed anti-Semitism, he meant it. The Labour Party is completely changed now from the party that was heavily defeated in 2019. That's real leadership, and he was able to do it because he had a mandate to do it, and that's what Rishi Sunak lacks, and that's why he's been weak. I thought it was very telling that 3 times he was given the opportunity to explain where he will plug, how he will plug the £46 billion black hole in the Conservative spending plans. Is it cuts to the NHS or is it tax rises? 3 times he was asked and 3 times he couldn't tell us. So that's important, because if we had a black hole like that in our spending plans, every single broadcaster would be challenging Labour politicians again and again and again, say, where's the money coming from? So where is the money coming from, Greg? Because that's a question every single one of you should be asked on every single programme.
Well, I think,
is it tax
might,
rises or spending cuts?
First of all, I think it's wishful thinking, your idea that Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party. The Labour MPs sat around you each week at PMQs are the same ones who all wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister in 2019 and 2017, which is exactly what Keir Starmer. In terms of the abolition of national insurance, that is a long-term ambition, which will be set out in due course that you would expect for long-term ambitions. But the idea that Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party...
I've got a long-term ambition to be an Olympic swimmer. I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, you better start training.
And so are you flogging pie-in-the-sky policies, or actually are you going to make the same mistake as
what we'd like to see, Wes, is any plan from Labour
leaving people with higher taxes.
We're not seeing any plan from Labour whatsoever on the economy.
I'm going to interrupt both of you. Hang on. I'm going to interrupt both of you because, hardly surprising, these two politicians are talking past each other on slightly different things. Explain this issue, because Keir Starmer did ask the question, Wes is right, about where and how the Conservatives, the government, would pay for this idea of scrapping national insurance. And we've heard from Greg, it's a long-term plan. What's it about?
Well, you've got to cast your mind back to the budget Jeremy Hunt delivered, which was at the start of March, where for the second successive fiscal event following the autumn statement the preceding November, he cut national insurance by 2 pence in the pound. And he said, and it was a kind of rhetorical flourish rather than anything in the red book of all the details, he said that the government wanted to go further in time and abolish national insurance altogether. But that question of in time, or what Greg referred to as in due course, is extremely mysterious. Does that mean that they're going to go into the general election proposing to do it over the course of 1 parliament or 2 parliaments, or is it just going to be an aspiration? But into that sort of vacuum of detail, you see Wes and the Labour Party, Keir Starmer in Prime Minister's question saying, well, hang on a second, this should be more specifically explained to the public, and also it should be costed, as they argue.
Do you accept, though, Greg, that this attempt by Labour to tie Rishi Sunak to Liz Truss, his predecessor, does allow Labour and the leader of the opposition to say, we've had 5 Conservative Prime Ministers in the last few years, and the last one crashed the economy?
Well, look, again, I think it reminds, actually, people everywhere that it was actually Rishi Sunak who took on Liz Truss and took on her economic policies. A lot of people, he could have, taken an easy way out, but he was absolutely clear in the summer of 2022 where Liz Truss's economic policy would lead. He was absolutely right then. He's right now to say the same about Keir Starmer's lack of an economic plan.
Well, actually, I mean, that is where Greg does have a point, Wes Streeting, because in hindsight, who was more supportive of Liz Truss's economic policies when she was Prime Minister? All those unfunded tax cuts out of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. It was Keir Starmer.
Now, hang on. We've always said that we want to see the burden on working people in terms of tax fall in this country, because even after the attempts to give money back in national insurance cuts, the tax burden is still higher now than it was 14 years ago.
But you supported the cut in the basic rate of income tax, which is what Liz Truss was suggesting at the time.
I think it's absolutely not true to say that we supported the economic vandalism of Liz Truss, the way in which they bulldozed through respected institutions in our economy, particularly the Office for Budget Responsibility. But you look at Liz Truss's attack on the Bank of England this week, blaming everyone else other than themselves. And one thing I'd just say about where we find ourselves now and what the future might look like, God forbid if the Conservatives won the next general election. In the smoking bill yesterday, you saw on the left of the chamber all of the Trussites en masse, the libertarian right-wing Conservatives. And then on the other side of the chamber, on the Conservative benches, you had all of the people supporting the Prime Minister. And almost all of those sensible voices are ones who've already said they're throwing in the towel and standing down next general election. So I think when people go into the ballot box in the next general election, they've got to keep in mind, if you're voting Conservative, you are not voting for Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister, because they will get him out the moment they get the chance. They didn't vote for him before, they will not vote for him again. They will get him out, and who knows what foaming at the mouth right-winger we will end up with in number 10 if the Conservatives, this Conservative Party wins the next general election, because your party's become the momentum of the right.
The importance of House of Commons chamber geography, Wes, because we all remember that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, it was Keir Starmer who sat next to him, saying that he wants Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, was his shadow Brexit Secretary of State, whilst actually most other members of the current shadow cabinet were set as far away as possible.
Do you think that's still going to resonate? Do you think that's still going to resonate with voters?
Well, I think it does, because people voted, people remember Jeremy Corbyn, and they remember the fact that Keir Starmer was one of Jeremy Corbyn's closest backers, saying not just once, but twice. But twice. He served in his shadow cabinet. Rachel Reeves, others
let me put it this way. Who do you think people will remember more? Liz Truss, which is quite recent.
People definitely remember Jeremy Corbyn more.
Well,
100%. He was there for much longer.
This is all they've got left. They don't have a serious plan. They have an appalling record, and they are up against a changed Labour Party. It's no use fighting the past. You've got to face the Labour Party in front of you, and it is match fit and ready for a general election whenever you want one, because Keir Starmer has shown the tough, strong and decisive leadership to change the Labour Party, deal with Jeremy Corbyn. All of those people who supported him have either left the Labour Party or been kicked out of the Labour Party or are marginalised in the Labour Party. It is a changed party, and we are now in a position where we can change the country to clean up the terrible mess you lot have left after 14 years. It's not just
hang on.
This is 14 years now of this calamity.
Well,
that
Keir
has led
Starmer
to
was
the
pointing the
longest
finger at Liz Truss,
waiting list
and
in
it is clear
NHS
Rishi
history.
Sunak is right. He did not back her economic prospectus at the time of the leadership campaign. He said it would bring the sort of disaster that commentators feel she did in terms of the market spiralling. But in terms of honesty about the state of the public finances, I'm not saying this, but the Office for Budget Responsibility has said neither party is being totally honest in terms of spending plans, which have been called a work of fiction on both sides. Do you accept that?
No, I don't accept that. And the key difference, I think, is you can actually see what the Conservatives have done over the last year. Today's inflation data, inflation is a third of what it was at its peak, which has enabled us to cut taxes. Talking about tax cuts in the future, what about tax cuts at the moment?
Right.
The Conservatives have introduced a £900 national insurance tax cut for people. We're getting more people into work. There's 4 million more people in employment today than there were when we took over
Although
from
the
Labour
figures
in
of people
2010.
on long-term sick
So
are a
actually,
disaster.
well, hold on. But actually, Jo, in terms of what we're actually delivering, this year has been a strong record of curbing inflation, getting taxes down, getting more people into jobs.
The Bank of England, of course, has that mandate to get it down to 2%. Would you agree that the plan is working, to quote Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives, because inflation is down?
Listening to Greg is a bit like listening to arsonists saying, we know we set the house on fire, but don't worry, we put the fire out in the kitchen now. I think when they go out, as Rishi Sunak did today, trying to mount a defence of his government's record, and he lists all of these things that he thinks are great achievements, I think it really sticks in the craw for people at home, because people go, hang on a minute, do you have any understanding of how bad things are in the country right now? Do you know that we're still really feeling the pinch in our pockets when the rent goes out or the mortgage goes out or they go to the supermarket or they can't get their GP appointment?
Would you appreciate, if you win the election, inheriting a slightly better economy then?
No, let me tell you, and going back to your challenge on the OBR and the OBR's challenge to us.
Are you being honest about it?
I think we are. I mean, look, we get a lot of flack. I know we are, because we get a lot of flack from people who are saying that we're not committed to spending enough, that we're not committing to fund enough. And that's because we are having to make very difficult choices in the knowledge that if there's a Labour government after the general election, we are going to have a bloody difficult job to do because of the absolute mess you lot
So what is the point of voting Labour if there's no change?
I'll tell you, 2 million more appointments a year to cut NHS waiting lists, making sure that we deliver mental health support in every primary and secondary school in the country, delivering 700,000 more NHS dentistry appointments every year, reforming the dentistry contract.
That will be paid for, by the way.
All of our policies are fully costed
like
and
the
fully
28
funded.
billion ones,
and you've got an absolute cheat, Greg, because we are still living with the consequences of a Prime Minister that you supported who crashed the economy, who sent taxes up, mortgages up, rents up. And all of those policies I just mentioned all of those policies I just mentioned are fully costed and fully funded. That's the Labour difference, because we will not make the same mistake.
We really are
as the
in an
Conservatives.
election campaign, whether it's the local elections or the general election to come. And this, presumably, will set the contours in terms of economic record and whether there'll be any change. Under Labour.
Yeah, it's the battle of a few different numbers, isn't it? You've got the Labour Party wanting to talk about 14. That's the number of years the Conservatives have been in government. They want to match the, they want to talk about Rishi Sunak in the context of 5 different Conservative Prime Ministers, but also 49. That's the number of days that Liz Truss was Prime Minister. They don't want people to forget that, as Greg claims they might do. And then Rishi Sunak, his number is 2. That's the Bank of England's target percentage rate of inflation. And he's arguing that because of what he's doing, inflation is coming down steadily to that rate. And those, I think, are the contours of the general election campaign whenever it begins.
Let's talk about Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, because actually Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, made a joke at her expense, saying that the Labour leader should be reading her tax advice rather than Liz Truss's book. Let's just have a look at the headline here in the Times. Police look at multiple allegations over Rayner. Investigation is expected to take weeks. What's going on here, Henry?
Well, look, to state the obvious, it's worse for the Labour Party that their deputy leader is under investigation by Greater Manchester Police than it would be if she wasn't. What exactly they're investigating is not completely clear. I mean, it follows claims in a book by Lord Ashcroft, former Conservative peer, he's not a peer anymore, about her residential situation before she was an MP, just before she became an MP, in fact, and about whether she simultaneously, for different purposes, claimed that her residence was one place or was another property that her husband owned. Now, crucially, the first property she had bought under right to buy, and the claim that has been made in some quarters, we don't precisely know if this is what Greater Manchester Police are investigating, and which she denies, is that by claiming that that was her main property, even though she wasn't actually living there, that's the claim, she managed to get capital gains tax relief as a result of that, which some people are claiming she might not have been owed. But then there are also associated questions about whether she was registered at the correct address. That's the broad contours of it.
Are you concerned, Wes, that the police investigation into Angela Rayner is now wider than previously thought, as that report says?
I think, as Angela said, it's an opportunity to draw a line under what has been kind of consistent Conservative mudslinging at Angela Rayner for some weeks now. She said that she's very happy to cooperate with HMRC or the police, and in this case, Greater Manchester Police are investigating. We make no criticism of that whatsoever. She should cooperate fully. And if you're in any doubt about where Angela Rayner sits on this and how she feels about this and the way in which she's responding to this, look at the simple fact that she's made it very clear that if she has broken the law, that she will resign. Now, Rishi Sunak didn't resign when he was fined for breaking the rules that the rest of the country were asked to follow. That is how strongly Angela Rayner feels. That's the way she conducts herself as a person, let alone a politician. And I think she will come out stronger for all of this. You know, she's a tough woman. She's had harder knocks in life than this. She's convinced she's done the right thing all along. She's taken fresh advice. She'll cooperate fully with the police.
Well, what do you say to all that, Greg?
Well, I think the most extraordinary thing is Sir Keir Starmer, who, of course, prides himself on his legal career and his legal background, seemingly refusing to look at the legal advice that Angela Rayner says that she has received. And I think we probably know why he won't look at it. I think it's easier for him to say it's nothing to do with me, but actually this is the deputy leader of the Labour Party. So I think we need to know why Keir Starmer is refusing to look at this advice that he says his staff have looked at, but he hasn't.
Well, let's just look at this headline in The Times, Greg. Angela Rayner's only crime is being an uppity lass. This is from Matthew Parris, former Conservative MP, in his column piece, I should say. The hounding of Angela Rayner is outrageous, brutal, snobbish and completely out of proportion to any mistake she may or may not have made. Has he got a point?
Well, I think, look, there's an investigation going on by the police, is where we started with this. I don't think it'd be fair to accuse the police of any sort of prejudice or anything like that. I think the police will approach these things professionally and dispassionately.
I think he's talking about the hounding by Conservatives, not the hounding of the police.
Well, I just stress again, though, that it is an active police investigation. It's difficult to comment on an active police investigation in this way. I haven't read Matthew Parris's column, but I repeat the fact, I do think the most extraordinary thing is for somebody who prides himself on his legal record not to have studied that legal advice.
Maybe you haven't read Matthew Parris. Maybe you've read former colleague of yours, Conservative MP, Nick Bowles. The Conservative attack, he says, on Angela Rayner is one of the most grotesque spectacles of hypocrisy I have witnessed. On one side is a billionaire Tory peer, as referenced by Henry Lord Ashcroft, and a multi-millionaire Tory Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, whose families have all avoided paying millions of pounds in the UK tax as beneficiaries of non-dom status and the lives of luxury. On the other is a woman who grew up in poverty, caring for her illiterate mother, who is now mother to a child who is registered blind, and through her own guts and character has risen to the deputy leader of the Labour Party. What's your response to that?
My response is let us see what the police investigation brings. That is the only sensible position for us to have on the actual charges, to wait for the investigation to run its course.
All right, let me talk about something else. This is BBC News headline. It was a very important report. Hilary Cass, weak evidence letting down children over gender care. It was released a few days ago, and it is all about gender identity services. Do you have concerns, and have you had concerns that children have been let down by the NHS under your government over this issue, Greg?
Well, I think we've all had concerns, to be frank, Jo, and that is why the government commissioned the review, and that is why I think the review has been very well received by the government. And action has been taken.
Right. You've said that in light of this report, Wes, you've been having some self-criticism and reflection, and that you were wrong in the past to say that all trans women are women. Why did you say that?
Well, actually, the full quote was reference to the Stonewall campaign, the Get Over It campaign, and actually, this is my views on this pre-Cass. Actually, I've been saying for some years now, in terms of both the way in which the debate has been conducted and the conversation has been had. But also, you know, some of the practical issues raised by Hilary Cass in relation to healthcare, which are deeply concerning. That, you know, to say to people in this space, get over it, before we've had the conversation about actually some thorny issues. In the Hilary Cass's case, it's about how we deliver high-quality healthcare to very vulnerable children and young people. Lots of women have raised concerns about sex-based rights and women's-only spaces. And I think it was wrong to say, get over it, when actually what we needed in this space was a much healthier conversation. And I've seen the way that some of my colleagues have been treated.
Well, Rosie Duffield is one.
Absolutely.
I mean, we can show this.
Some of my gay colleagues in Parliament being called paedophiles and groomers. It has been utterly toxic. And actually loads of MPs and actually lots of people more generally just want to keep their heads down on this topic, because people are frightened if they speak up in any respect in this debate that they might say the wrong thing or worse still be silenced and shut down, and that is not a good place to be. And that's why I've made it very clear, even in the general election year, we will work with the government to make sure we get this right and try and take all the heat out of this,
because
so we have more light.
There certainly was too much heat before. I mean, you mention people that have perhaps been treated badly when it comes to discussing this issue. Rosie Duffield, a Labour MP, here in the Mail, saying, where was Keir Starmer when I was being bullied and threatened by the trans lobby and, worse, my colleagues in the Labour Party? Now, she mentions you, but not in those terms, and she agrees with you now completely. But should the Labour Party and Keir Starmer apologise to Rosie Duffield over the way she certainly feels she was treated?
Well, look, I think that the abuse that she's received is inexcusable, and no one should be treated like that. And look, I've said in the past, I'm very sorry about the way that Rosie has been treated.
Have you spoken to Rosie about this, Wes?
I certainly have, but I'm not going to go any further on private conversations. That wouldn't be fair to Rosie either. But let me just say that I think that from my perspective, Keir's perspective, we want to make sure that she feels welcome in the Parliamentary Labour Party, that she feels included in the Parliamentary Labour Party. She'll be a Labour candidate in the next general election with full support. And I want to make sure that colleagues in Parliament, whether they are colleagues like Rosie, who've been raising concerns on this for some years and has felt attacked, and particularly on social media, or indeed my gay colleagues who've been called groomers and paedophiles.
But does Keir Starmer need to apologise
We've got to make sure that people
because it's him that she is directing most of this criticism at. Should he apologise to her?
Look, I've not seen what Rosie. I've not actually read the full article that Rosie's written. But I have no doubt whatsoever that Keir wants Rosie to feel supported and included and respected.
But to be fair, I think she has actually been saying this for a long time.
Yes,
although
well,
it's today's article, this has been going on a long time in the Labour Party.
It has, but we've just heard from Wes Streeting, who is part of the shadow cabinet, explaining now the situation when it comes to Rosie Dufford in Labour. Thank you very much to all of my guests. That's it. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Beware of the Punisher. He's on for the Triple Crown.